Hi, my name is Michael Overa, and this video lecture series is intended for my English 102 class at Shoreline Community College. It's really for anybody who's interested in deeper understanding of Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. So this is the book that we've been reading in class, and I'm just going to go through a little bit of intro and contextualization, and then the first two chapters. So I guess my hope is that via this lecture series you'll gain a further or deeper understanding of the book itself and further investigate the themes that Margaret Atwood is presenting here. And it's by no means intended as a comprehensive or exhaustive analysis of Oryx and Crake. Feel free to ask questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. So, just to contextualize, as many of you may know, I'm not a big fan of the thought that we have to know all about an author's autobiography in order to further understand their work. But in this case, I do want to give a little bit of background. I can scarcely say enough about how much I admire Atwood's intelligence and writing prowess. What we do need to know maybe is that she's a prolific writer. She's Canadian. Oryx and Crake is the first of 3 books in this Mad Adam series that is patently apocalyptic, but does sort of, as we've talked about in class, move from dystopian to apocalyptic. So if we talk about dystopian as the individual or the protagonist against society, then apocalypse is society is no more. And we see that sort of transition here. The other thing I want to point out, and we talked about this in class, is the distinction that Atwood in particular makes between science fiction, which is the future, rocket ships, aliens, and speculative fiction, which are things that could happen. By all means, Oryx and Crake is based on things that already exist and technology that already exists, right? Not to say that everything in the book has happened, but I think that Atwood would posit that it could happen. It seems that that's the trajectory we're going down. Okay, so we're going to start with the epigraphs, and there are a few things that we'll skip over just because I don't want to spoil it too much. But the first epigraph of the book is from Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. It says, "I could perhaps, like others, have astonished you with strange and probable tales, but I rather choose to relate plain matter of fact in the simplest manner and style, because my principal design was to inform you and not to amuse you." So that gives us some sense, to inform, not to amuse. Now again, the other thing to bear in mind is that Gulliver's Travels is about Lemuel Gulliver, who ends up washed up on shore in a strange land, and most of us are familiar with the first part, the Lilliputians, who of course are tiny people who tie him down. So that gives us some context to this idea that he is a foreigner in this land that he's part of. The second epigraph is from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is referenced again in the text later on. Woolf's novel plays with the way that time works and begins just before World War I. So we see sort of a connection to what we talked about with the wasteland and with this sort of apocalyptic feeling. This story here itself deals with how quickly life moves, the necessity of art, the nature of reality. And here I think it's important to pay attention to the idea that, quote, "there is no guide, no shelter, but all was a miracle." Here we have the idea of safety, humanity, and the continuation of the themes that we did see in The Wasteland, again, as we sort of investigate the nature of the apocalypse and what it means to be human. Okay, so just a little bit of context. Again, I do want to move through this rather quickly. So the chapters themselves are subdivided into smaller named sections, and I feel it would be silly to think that these names are arbitrary, that Atwood didn't have an intent to. So we'll do our best to sort of try and figure out what those sections mean. So the first section is Mango, and Mango begins with Snowman waking up in the morning. We get a description of the area, nature, the ocean, Quote, the ersatz reefs, rusted car parts, and jumbled bricks and assorted rubble. So sort of fake or artificial reef. And so we get this idea already about nature versus artificiality. We also learn that he has a watch that he uses only as a talisman because it no longer works. Batteries, of course, are finite. And he notes that nobody nowhere knows what time it is. So this idea of time, timelessness, losing track of time, and again, a piece of technology that harkens to the past. So he climbs down from his tree, his home, the place where he sleeps in order to protect himself. Then we find out that he wears a dirty bed sheet, an authentic replica Red Sox baseball cap, and eventually we find out he has these broken sunglasses, just one lens, and we'll talk about that further as well. In a nearby cache, he has a half bottle of scotch, some no-meat sveltana cocktail sausages, an energy bar, and a mango. And so that seems to be where we're getting the title here. The first literary reference makes its appearance here, quote, in strict adherence to daily routine that tends towards the maintenance of good morale and the preservation of sanity. So this is from Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and some of you may have read this before. The protagonist of that story, Billy Pilgrim, is sort of moving back and forth through time, trying to make sense of some traumas, and so there's a sense of isolation there that Snowman seems to be connecting to. Again, it also gives us our first clue of who Snowman was previously, that he was literate, that he knew these books, that he knew them well, and that what comes to mind is actually an appropriate quote for his situation. However, he can't remember where it's from or its significance. The section ends with Snowman sitting down to eat a mango. Now, at first blush, like I said, that might seem arbitrary. However, what's interesting is if you look up the symbolism, it would probably be very obvious if you were eating, say, an apple, and we would see a sort of biblical reference eventually. But it is more like the hyacinth in the wasteland. It's there, it's present, but it is maybe a little bit subdued. We have to sort of look at it a little bit. So the mango is historically a symbol of fertility, wealth, and immortality, themes that will play out further in this. And again, similar to themes that we saw in the wasteland. And so when we come up to those references, we'll try and point them out as they happen. Okay, so moving forward, Flotsam is the second named section. The term, obviously, flotsam means things washed up on the shore. There are no specific or literal depictions. There are a few specific and literal depictions of flotsam here, but I think it could also follow on the idea of Gulliver's Travels being washed up on a foreign shore. We have our first introduction to the kids on the beach, and we don't know yet, but we will soon be properly introduced to them. They're scavenging, and they want to know what these things are, right? We do learn that they are, quote, thick-skinned, resistant to ultraviolet. The kids bring several pieces of flotsam to him: a hubcap, a piano key, a chunk of a pop bottle, a Bliss Plus container, a bucket o' nubbins, and a computer mouse. Oh, sorry, that's an empty bucket o' nubbins. We have to assume that these inclusions are not completely arbitrary, but rather chosen intentionally by Atwood. A piano key, maybe a reference to art. Bliss Plus container will come up later, but a reference to drugs. And ditto, as Snowman would say, the bucket. The computer mouse might be a reflection of technology. Again, I'm not saying that these are or that there certainly are, but that there's a possibility, and it seems that there's an intentionality behind this that seems to speak to a greater meaning, right? Here we also get our first introduction to Crake, some form of authority, and the origin of Snowman's name, from Abominable Snowman, a sort of FU to Crake, whoever Crake is. We also get some indication that the people were created in Crake's image, one of many biblical allusions to come. And we get the name for the creatures, the children of Crake. We also get a reference to his beard as feathers. Who knows, maybe a reference to Icarus flying too close to the sun. Very possible. The next section, voice. Voice begins with Snowman talking. So there's a surprise. But he's really still quoting, and this time it's from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Not only does he speak these out of loneliness, the poem focuses on the idea of a sailor having killed an albatross. And some of you may know the reference to an albatross. A reference to something that weighs on somebody's mind, a type of guilt, the idea that one has done wrong. And we get the first few references to wanting to hear another human's voice and to sex, 2 references to companionship and connection. Again, things we talked about in the Wasteland, things that will sort of continue here. These are things that Snowman is missing. And this section ends with him yelling at Crake, the accusation that Crake did this. And even though we don't know what exactly he's referring to, we don't know if it's the situation that Snowman is in or something grander. Okay, so Chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts with this section titled Bonfire. There's a bit more exposition. We learn that Snowman used to be named Jimmy. So first situation where we learn about the duality of names here and identities. We learn that there were animals that were burnt because they were diseased. And we get some idea about the dystopian world that was pre-apocalypse in Oryx and Crake. And there seemed to be some genetic engineering going on here. And we learn that something about the reason the animals were burned, quote, to keep the disease from spreading. So again, the idea of disease. We also learned something about the nature of the relationship between Jimmy's parents and some amount of the capriciousness of his mother and sort of her depressive state. In some ways, I think this is Atwood's introduction to the world pre-apocalypse, a world that is hyper afraid of disease, that is always on guard, that is run by corporations. There's a stratification of the people that live in the compounds and the people that live in the plebes, of course, plebes from plebeian or lower class, right? So there's a sense of self-preservation and paranoia that goes hand in hand here. We get our first hint at the nature of capitalism. This world is very cutthroat, right? And everybody's trying to beat the competition to the next biotechnological product. We can draw another parallel here to the Wasteland, in particular, maybe the fire sermon, but I think that might be stretching a little bit to say that Atwood was intentionally referencing the fire sermon. It probably has more to do with the significance of fire as a purifying thing and, again, sort of a tool of mankind. Right? Okay, next section, Organ Inc. So this is where Jimmy's father works. We learn that his father worked on the Methuselah mouse. We learn that he's at work on pigoons, which are pigs that grow human organs that can be transplanted. So again, we get this sort of genetic modification. Again, something that is sort of a technology that is already sort of being worked on and being improved. We learn a little bit more about the genetic modifications and splicing. Mankind is playing God in many ways. And the question of bioethics is present, although not necessarily addressed. In many ways, it seems as though the ethics are sort of pushed to the side, except for those things that weigh on the mind of Jimmy's mom, Sharon. We learn about Ramona and tangentially a little bit more about Jimmy's mom, who used to be smart and used to be a scientist, but now is sort of what Ramona and his dad are saying is sort of wasting her talent. Almost as important as the idea of humans tinkering with the genetic code in animals is the introduction of the class idea at the end of the section. Again, the stratification, social classes developed again more later on with the plebeians. Clear distinction between the haves and the have-nots. Right? Power means money and money means power. Everything is for sale and nothing is sacred. And again, that's a theme that will come up again, is that everything is for sale. So keep an eye out for that one. The next section, so the last section here that we'll talk about in this lecture is lunch. So we'll cruise through this, which is not to diminish it, but it seems more background than action, intended to help us with further understanding of the story. So the title here seems functional. Correct me, maybe some of you see this another way and there's another reading of it. Focuses primarily on the relationship between Jimmy and his mother. We learn about that her job was before she gave it up, and there's a sort of intimation that she gave it up for ethical reasons. We learn later on through hints that maybe she felt that Oregon Inc. was doing wrong, We learn a little bit about her past scientific life, locking cells, preventing cells from disease. Again, disease is a big thing that's going to come up here. She was protecting those cells against infection. Perhaps a relationship is the thing that becomes most salient. We learn that Jimmy, although empathic in his youth, never really had a good set of relationship or a good model. This follows on themes presented in the Oregon Inc. section, where we learn that Jimmy's relationship with his father was also rather superficial. Here it's not a great deal different, and so this theme of parent-child relationships will come up again and again in the novel. And this chapter is only kind of the first look at that complex nature of Jimmy's relationships. So I hope that's helpful. Again, there are probably many other things that I didn't mention or forgot to mention that maybe you observed, or maybe other readings of this. I'm by no means saying this is the only reading, only trying to sort of start a conversation of what the possibilities are. All right, I'll try and put up another lecture later this week for the remainder of the reading. All right, thanks.